Hey guys, Jonathan here with TLD, back with part 3 of the fastest MacBook Pro on the planet upgrade series. I know it's been a while since I uploaded part 2, so to quickly recap, I'm using a late 2011 15-inch Core i7 2.5 GHz quad-core MacBook Pro. I've upgraded the RAM from 4 gigs to 16 gigs and replaced the stock hard drive with an OCZ 120GB Vertex 3 SSD. Now today I'll be one-upping myself by ripping out the optical drive, then throwing a second OCZ SSD in its place, and then setting them up in an insanely fast and utterly delicious RAID configuration. If you happen to miss part 1 or part 2, you can catch up on those by clicking either one of these annotations. And as far as this video goes, I'll be using 5 things. A nylon pry tool, which is strangely enough also known as a spudger. I just spudged all over my... never mind. I'll also be using a Phillips 00 screwdriver, a Torx T6 screwdriver, the second OCZ SSD, and finally an OWC data doubler to house the SSD. First thing we're going to do is whip out our spudger and then gently lift the battery connector from the logic board, and now we can begin removing the optical drive. Next, we're going to lift the 2 data cables to the right of the optical drive. Remember to be very gentle with these, and then we're going to toss aside the spudger and whip out the Torx screwdriver. Before we can get to that first screw, we'll have to detach this cable right here. After that screw is removed, we're going to switch to the Phillips screwdriver and remove these 2 screws here and here. Next, we're going to carefully lift this plastic piece, being very cautious not to pull anything out of place, and then we're going to switch back to the Torx screwdriver and remove the now exposed screw. We have one more screw below that, and once that is removed, we can now begin to pull out the optical drive. With the now infamous spudger, we're going to gently lift the optical drive until we can pull it out with our hands, and once that's out, we're going to do a little prep work by first detaching the SATA cable, and then using the Phillips screwdriver to remove these 2 screws so we can pull off the metal bracket, and now it is SSD time. First thing we're going to do is align the SATA and power connections on the SSD and then slide it into the data doubler. Next, we're going to secure the SSD in place by installing the 2 screws on the side, and then we're going to screw in the metal bracket we had removed from the optical drive. Lastly, we're going to pop the SATA cable we had removed from the optical drive onto the data doubler, and now we can slide the SSD into the MacBook Pro. Just take your time, make sure everything's aligned properly, and then we're going to go in reverse order, starting by connecting the data cables. From there, we have the bottom left-hand screw, and remember this is using the Torx screwdriver. We then have one more Torx screw above that, and once that is done, we can begin securing this plastic piece back in place using the Phillips screwdriver here and here. Now we just have one more Torx screw left, and once that's in, we can reattach this cable back here. And finally, all we gotta do is reconnect the battery connector to the logic board, and we can close up the MacBook Pro. So now that all the dirty work is done, I'll show you guys how to set up a RAID configuration, and we'll start by popping in the Lion Recovery USB drive and powering up the MacBook Pro. First thing we're going to do is set up the network by entering the Wi-Fi password. Thumbs up if you guys have seen that commercial. And then we're going to select the recovery drive to boot into. We're going to want to select Disk Utility and start by formatting each drive and setting them up for RAID. So we'll begin with the first SSD by selecting the partition tab, one partition, and then make sure it's set to the GUID partition table, and then we can hit apply. Rinse and repeat for the second SSD, and then we'll hop over to the RAID tab. Select Stripe RAID, and for those of you guys curious, Mirrored RAID writes the file twice, once to each drive, and essentially is a constant real-time backup, whereas Striped RAID splits the file to each drive as one partition, speeding up the access time and thus resulting in faster performance. Once that's all set up, all we gotta do is select the newly created RAID partition to install Lion on, and that is it. It should take around 20 minutes or so to install, but through the magic of video, we are done. We can now boot up the MacBook Pro in all of its RAID goodness and look at some benchmarks. For read speeds, I got a mouth-watering 963 megabytes a second and a ridiculous 831 megabytes a second for write speeds. In contrast, here's what the RAID performance looks like versus a single SSD as well as a traditional 7200 RPM hard drive. Clearly you guys can see a huge performance difference. And lastly, we'll look at the RAID setup tearing through a 2GB file duplication as we wrap up the video. Now there are some risks going with a striped RAID setup due to the fact that since there's 2 drives as one partition, if one of those fails, everything fails. So for the majority of you guys out there, I wouldn't necessarily recommend this setup unless you just got cash to blow and you want the utmost badass kind of performance out of your system. But I would say upgrading to a single SSD is probably one of the best upgrades you can do to your system as far as boot times, access times, silence, just pure performance. SSDs, hands down, perform better than hard disk drives. Maybe more of a practical situation for those maybe interested in using the data doubler is to get maybe a 120GB SSD, use it as the boot drive, and then add maybe like a 500GB or 750GB hard disk drive as your media and storage based system. That way you kind of have the all-in-one best bang for the buck. So thank you guys for watching this video. Thank you guys who were patient with me, just been battling a lot of health problems, but I got this video out for you guys. If you enjoyed it, make sure to give it a thumbs up as it does help the channel out. I'll have links to everything I use in this video down in the description, as well as my Twitter link. So if you guys have any questions, just hit me up on Twitter. That is the best way to get in contact with me. And then lastly, I'll have a few links of the best price SSDs in case you guys are interested in upgrading. Aside from that, if you guys haven't subscribed, feel free to do so, and I will see you guys later.